Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Calm is Hot. I'm your host, Jade. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm very excited to have a personal friend of mine who's also a disability rights advocate and will hopefully educate us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Soh-Yeon. My pronouns are she, her, they, them, and I'm a patient advocate for ME or CFS. ME is short for myalgic encephalomyelitis. CFS is short for chronic fatigue syndrome. And now I joined a nonprofit organization called Long COVID Alliance. And so I do a lot of volunteer work for long COVID or long haulers or patients with long COVID as well.
Wow. Now, I'm sure many people are wondering, what is ME?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, ME is short for myalgic encephalomyelitis. It is a mouthful. It is the term itself, it kind of gets its meaning from the Latin roots, and it essentially means muscle pain and chronic brain and spinal inflammation. So it's under the category of post-viral illness. So a lot of people who get infected with associated list of viruses, they don't end up recovering once they're infected. And so they kind of have this ongoing symptoms and additional symptoms they kind of develop over time. And so that's what ME is. And the similarity with long COVID is that COVID is also a viral infection. And there are a percentage of people who don't recover once they've been infected with COVID-19.
Now, I know you just highlighted the diagnosis process and symptoms. Do you want to say more about the diagnosis process and some of the symptoms that ME brings about?
Yeah, so currently there isn't a diagnostic test for ME. There isn't one for long COVID either, technically, although sometimes if you do have positive test for COVID-19, that could potentially be helpful in indicating whether or not you have long COVID, but it's not a direct diagnostic test. And so what happens is that people either have initial symptoms and then over the course of about 6 months, they don't have any kind of relief in symptoms. And at that point, they can start exploring whether or not they have ME. And it's really a process of elimination. So doctors would often do a lot of different tests based on the symptoms to see if you have any other diagnosis, any other autoimmune disease, a bunch of other possibilities. And then if you don't have any of that, and then if you also have tested positive for either past or current infection of viruses that's associated with ME, then that's one of the ways that you can get diagnosed with ME. So it's a very long process. It's a very expensive process because you have to kind of go through all these steps. It's like you have to go through one step at a time until you finally get to the ME diagnosis.
I'm imagining because it's an expensive and long process,
Mhm.
there's probably a lot of people out there who, one, might not even know they have it, and two, might not have access to the resources it takes to get a diagnosis.
Yeah, so I researched some statistics, and it takes on average about 1 to 5 years for people to get diagnosed with ME. And most of the people who do get diagnosed are Caucasians or white American in America. Oftentimes, people can be barred from being diagnosed at all with ME because of that specific reason.
That's awful. So there's definitely, we know many reasons that communities, especially marginalized communities, people of color, low income, have barriers to accessing healthcare, but this just seems like it is set up for only people with access to healthcare and the resources, especially money, to be able to pursue the tests and the years that it takes to get this diagnosis. That's just one extra very clear indication that our system is broken and truly only affords people who can, only benefits people who can afford it. And I think that's got to change.
Yeah, Yeah. And we're talking about 1 to 5 years for people who can afford it, essentially. So, I mean, personally, it took me about 20 years. I mean, I had it when I was pretty young. I started experiencing symptoms when I was in middle school. And especially back then, it wasn't like, I mean, because of long COVID or COVID-19, everyone kind of knows about this post-viral illness now. But especially a decade or two ago, people really didn't know about it. It's still not taught in medical school. And so that adds to the challenge of being diagnosed in the first place.
Now, I know that you mentioned a similarity earlier between ME and people who are diagnosed with long COVID. Do you mind speaking to that similarity?
Yeah, COVID-19 as a virus is essentially something that can trigger ME. So long COVID is kind of unique in a way that it does present a lot of different or a lot of new symptoms that's not sometimes included in the traditional like ME symptom profile. So like people see like discoloration in their hands or their feet. It could be very organ specific. So a lot of people have like lung damage or they have like damage in their heart. So it could be also be very organ specific. And that's not to say that people with ME, because there is a long list of viruses, don't experience their individual unique symptoms. There definitely are, but it's just that there are a core set of symptoms that kind of gets people diagnosed with ME. And so it's pretty similar with long haulers. They initially start out with classic COVID-19 symptoms, and then they start seeing some other lingering, very odd symptoms. And then over the course of 6 months plus, they might see extreme exhaustion, their ability to function every day might decline, that kind of stuff. And then, as it goes past the 6 month mark, they might eventually be diagnosed with ME. So far, it's estimated about 60% of people with long COVID are or have ME. So that's pretty a large number of people.
60% of people who get long COVID will develop ME.
Yeah, they currently 60% of people with long COVID have ME.
That is a huge percentage.
Yeah, and to actually put a figure, there was a statistic that there was a actual figure that was recorded in mid-October of last year, and it kind of tallied how many people have long COVID globally, and that was about 100 million people. And so 60% of that, we're talking about 60 million people worldwide who now have ME.
Wow. Wow. Now I'm imagining there's probably, and I know because you and I have spoken about this, a lot of interest in researching this now.
Yes, honestly, because ME community kind of saw this happen at the onset of the pandemic. So we already have information that SARS virus could trigger ME. So when we saw that this COVID-19 is a SARS type virus, we kind of expected that this would trigger ME in a lot of people. And based on historical figures, we thought about 30% of people who end up getting infected with COVID-19 are going to end up having ME. And I'm not exactly sure, but I think it's pretty accurate. I think that estimate is pretty accurate at the moment. So there's that.
Now you said 30, there was an estimate that 30% of people who got COVID and experienced the long COVID would develop ME.
No, just 30% of people who catch COVID are going to end up with ME.
Oh,
Yeah, that's based on the historical percentage of people who end up getting ME from other viral infections.
oh, okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yes.
And I'm imagining there's probably some funding and advocacy work happening, and that's part of what you do. Would you like to elaborate on your advocacy work?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, the ME community kind of saw this happening when we heard about COVID-19 virus. And that's kind of when we started getting to work almost immediately. So doctors, researchers, everyone kind of became alert. And I happen to already have been part of Solve ME Initiative. It's a nonprofit organization down in Los Angeles. They do a lot of data and also advocacy work for ME. So they do a lot of ME research and advocacy work. And so they actually ended up creating a whole separate organization called Long COVID Alliance, which is another organization that I'm also part of, but it's basically founded by the same people who started Solve ME Initiative, or who are part of Solve ME Initiative. And so, I mean, but they're not the only organization. There are various other organizations that really came together and partnered together. And they actually last year, I think it was last year, $1.15 billion in funding was passed by the Congress to fund post-viral illness. So that was one of the biggest accomplishments.
Now that was $1.5 billion.
$1.15 billion. Mm-hmm.
Whoa, approved by US Congress to study and research post-viral illness from COVID.
Yes.
Were you a part of that?
I can't say I was at the forefront of that, but definitely part of the organization that really pushed that forward.
Nice. You were a part of it. That's awesome. Now, because you do live with this, you live with ME, and to be clear, not from, as far as we both know, not from a COVID exposure, but you had ME before, and now you can relate, and there's a ton of research being offered to also help inform this massive amount of people who are now developing ME from post-viral infection from COVID. I'm imagining that there's a stronger sense of community. There's probably a bigger community of people looking for research, looking for support, and you offer that. You're a part of helping create space to offer that and help people feel connected and more informed. Do you want to speak more about that experience? Elaborate on your experience helping to bring people information and opportunity to connect.
Yeah, sure. The Long COVID Alliance actually has various types of working groups, and I'm one of the co-leads for a working group that does storytelling and media awareness work. So, I mean, long COVID, I was actually really surprised, but I'm also really glad that long COVID is getting the attention and recognition, because people have been doubting that ME is a real disease for such a long time that I thought people might not even believe that long COVID is really a thing. But at New York Times, Time Magazine, The Atlantic, all of these really credible media outlets were reporting on long COVID, and they still do. And so it's actually getting the proper attention that it deserves. And because of that, the work with Long COVID Alliance actually has been very meaningful in a way that we have a lot of different journalists from like NPR reaching out to us, wanting to get connected with people who have long COVID. And it's been very interesting to see like what kind of requests we get. Like journalists always have their own focus. And sometimes we get requests to speak with moms with long COVID, how they're affected a little bit more. They want to definitely like diversify the people that they're interviewing. And so that's been very interesting to observe and something to navigate, definitely. But because I'm part of that working group specifically where we are focusing on media awareness and storytelling, it's been very important to really be aware of different people who we can reach out to, how we're going to reach out to people. And like we mentioned earlier, some people don't even know that they have this, or people might have limited access to healthcare where they're not even getting properly diagnosed. And so really one of the challenges but something that we are definitely working towards is figuring out how to reach out to these different communities and to diversify our own access as an organization to reach out to different people of different background.
Which I think is so necessary, right?
Mhm.
Historically, medicine and medical information was always only ever created like by white people for white people in the US after
Mhm.
colonization. So it feels necessary. I feel like there's an urgency and a necessity to make medical information available to everybody. And
Mhm.
that's why I'm just calling attention to this, because I'm excited that you're a part of that. I think that's really, really awesome. And I'm grateful for you doing this. Are you comfortable speaking about your experiences?
Yeah, sure.
Would you
Mhm.
would you like to elaborate on a little bit more about your personal journey?
I started experiencing ME at a very young age. I started experiencing my symptoms around the time that I was in middle school. And then it kind of got gradually worse over time. By the time I entered college, I couldn't really move out of bed for like a week at a time. Every time I would go to the doctors, they would just say it's either stress or you're not sleeping enough, you're not taking care of yourself, and my blood works will come back normal. I was always deemed very healthy, but just maybe stressed. No one took my symptoms seriously. And I think, especially most of the time, actually, when you say that you're tired, people don't really know what that tired feels like. It's not like, oh, I just need to get some rest and I'll bounce back. It's just a complete exhaustion where you really have trouble like lifting your finger as you're like just laying down in bed, kind of exhaustion. And so I don't think doctors really knew to the extent like how debilitating this fatigue really was. I kind of had to just kind of deal with that on my own, which is really traumatizing. It's really devastating. You have a lot of life pressure to either get through college, to get through your tests, exams. Afterwards, you have to get a job. You have to like support yourself constantly, and to not be able to do that or to not be able to physically rely on your health to be able to carry that out it's really traumatizing. And then it was around a few years ago, around 2017, when I actually had to go to the emergency room because my symptoms got really bad. And then I took about a month off from work because I couldn't do anything. And it's then that my primary care doctor started really exploring, trying to figure out what was going on. And even then, my tests would come back normal. I had a lot of abusive doctors in between those appointments, where one doctor, he was a white male, middle-aged guy, and I was really distressed. I was right out of the emergency room visit the day before. He was the only doctor that I could get on that day. And yeah, I was really distressed. I went there with my parents, but they were waiting in the lobby and I was in the exam room by myself. And he was so put off by how upset I was. And he just said, "You're just really high strung. Most people like you just have to rest and you just have to like calm down and you'll get better." That was his attitude. And he character judged me and he asked me what profession I'm in and so or what my job is. And then he found out that I'm involved in the legal field and he's like, "Yeah, like you're definitely stressed out." And he kept watching, like looking at his watch, tapping his feet, just extremely manipulative. And he tried to act really nice when he opened the door to walk me out and pretended like he wasn't a total jerk through that entire interaction. I was really shocked. I mean, I've seen a lot by then, but I was still really shocked. And my parents could tell. And I actually ended up talking to the hospital admin or the director. And, but I mean, it wasn't as satisfying as I thought. I was like, this is what happened. She just kind of blamed it on communication issue and kind of whatever. That was just sort of the end of it. And then I had another doctor. She was actually an Asian female doctor, and my primary doctor was out of town. And so I needed someone to do my disability paperwork. And she just looked at my diagnosis code and she said, "Yeah, you just have to find purpose in life to get better." And that was like her entire tone. And she was also extremely rude throughout the entire appointment, which was also really shocking. And so there are a lot of these like little like incidences with different doctors. And then, but eventually my primary care doctor at the time like came around and she said, I think you have ME, I think you have CFS. And even she had a very outdated idea what this is. She tried to suggest that I have psychosomaticism. She thought like maybe this is like some sort of a psychological illness that's causing you to have like physical symptoms, all of this stuff. Like even when she did give me the correct diagnosis, she didn't bother to do the research. I don't know. It took me like 20 minutes on Google and PubMed in order for me to figure out that what this disease is really about. She didn't put that kind of in like effort in, or she just didn't know about what ME truly was at the time. So I asked her to refer me to a specialist, an infectious disease specialist who focuses on ME. And so she got me there, and that's how I started actually getting proper care. I was also referred to other doctors who are very knowledgeable in holistic medicine and ME. And so they were able to kind of really provide support that complements my treatment at the specialist clinic and all of that. And so eventually I got there, but I mean, took from the ER visit to the proper care took about a year or two. And then my overall diagnosis, it took about 20 years.
Wow. There are so many layers there. I'd love to just honor you in this moment, the reality that you had to experience, just the awfulness of our medical system in the US, where I think it's an institution that operates in power, perpetuating a lot of white supremacist ideologies. So much so that even when people of color become doctors and work in these institutions, oftentimes going through all of those processes, medical schools that are still very much so focused on catering to white patients, and all of the research, majority of it done on white patients, going through all of that process, it sadly makes sense to me as to how you could get a woman of color doctor, and you would hope that she would hear you, and for her not to, and to just be so dismissive. I'm partly shocked, and I'm also not, because I'm like, she's still operating in this really fucked up larger system of power.
Mhm.
And I am so grateful that one, you were able to get to the point where you could see an infectious disease specialist. And also, I just, my mind is just blown, right? Like, this is a disease where you're literally it's a disability where you're literally feeling exhausted, and you're having to fight every move that you make to just get treatment. And that in and of itself makes me so frustrated and angry at our system. But I'm going to pause with my feels, check in on you. How are you feeling? How are you doing? Sharing this?
Yeah, I'm actually fine. Actually, I was talking to one of the staff at Solve ME just earlier today, and we're talking about how to help people kind of tell their stories during congressional meeting and how it's such an emotional process. And she was like, I saw this really cool program one time where people actually share their stories in a small, safe group setting. And they kind of do that initially, and then they kind of do that repeatedly until they can kind of edit themselves out and kind of realize how to tell stories the way that they want to, and kind of cultivate their own storytelling. And so like, I kind of think about that. Like, I kind of share this story a lot. I've also heard a lot of stories from other people who have the same experience. And something that I think really causes a little bit more of concern for people of color is that I definitely wondered, oh, is the fact that I am a woman of color is subjecting me to this kind of treatment more frequently? That kind of concern was definitely there, and I would be on a very high alert because of that. But like I mentioned earlier, most of the people who are diagnosed with ME are primarily white, and they also have very similar experiences, if not the same experiences from medical professionals. And so like, not only was I able to kind of find a community where I can share my stories with people who understand it, but and could have also experienced the same, but I also realized that it's not just exclusive to people of color or to marginalized people that this happens. I think it really speaks to the fact that when you have ME or a medical condition where it's considered invisible because you physically cannot get tested for it, or a lot of people just don't even believe that it's a real disease, then you're kind of subjected to this kind of stuff all the time.
So the structure of the medical institution just perpetuating ableism, and I would argue creating a marginalization for people with disability, right? Dismissing anyone with this, regardless of race or gender. And that to me speaks to just like ableism in our society.
Yeah, someone actually said, one of the patient who is quote unquote like an influencer on social media who really talks a lot about disability rights and ME or CFS. She's like, doctors constantly are suspicious of people faking their disability. And she's like, I've seen people get denied disability when they actually deserve it. I've never seen a single disabled or person with disability who fakes it. Like, no one wants to fake this. And that's something that I actually had to reiterate to a lot of doctors. I said, I'm young, I'm ambitious, I have a lot of things that I want to do. I wouldn't be here spending my time and money being in your doctor's office if I didn't have to. I wouldn't be repeatedly coming over here and trying to get myself heard if this is not what I needed. And like that kind of direct communication is sometimes needed for them to kind of like think, oh shit, like maybe I do need to look into this.
I feel like there's two things I'd love to respond to. I totally hear you. I'm so grateful that this person is doing their work, using their influencer privilege to kind of call attention to this. Love to hear that. I think it's really important for me also in these conversations to remind myself, like, my relationship to this. I do feel like I have a privilege in relation to this conversation, and I want to mark that. And I also want to mark that I feel as though, because we live in also a capitalist society where your value is placed on your output, your production, how much you can do, all of these things, there's almost by default this way of thinking people buy into, this ideology where your self-worth is based on what you produce and how much you output. And that in and of itself should be just, we need to abolish that ideology. And we also need to start listening and trusting people. And also in the US, like if we're talking numbers, people who fight and battle to get disability do not make that much. Like, we could do an entire podcast on the breakdown of the numbers. It is not a cushy lifestyle. So this mentality of faking it to get a paycheck is like faking it for what? Breadcrumbs? Like so thank you for speaking to that. And then I just wanted to follow up and say, also, thank you for putting in your energy in this conversation, because your energy is precious and sacred. And so I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, and you brought up really important points. I had a doctor recently who actually saw me when I had acute symptoms back in 2017, when I was really struggling to find the appropriate care at the time. And I had to get my disability extended. And she said, "You were really smart to book an appointment with me because I know about your case and I've seen you before. If I hadn't seen you before, I would be asking a ton of questions about why you need this." And she's like, "Some people just don't have good reasons to be on disability." And like, that was, yeah, exactly. I mean, as especially having had this conversation right now about ME not being visible on tests or not being diagnostic tests, it's like, how do you, it's so subjective what that doctor is essentially saying. Like, I get to physically observe people and determine for myself if someone's healthy or not. And I very frequently hear people say, oh, but you're otherwise a healthy, like you're otherwise healthy, you're otherwise a very healthy young woman. And it's like, what is considered healthy? Like, is having 30% of capacity and energy compared to other people considered healthy? Like, can you really say that I'm healthy if I have to sacrifice going to grocery store if I'm doing my laundry for the day? It's actually really traumatizing for patients when they hear that. I don't think doctors are aware, but that's sort of like the default mentality of a lot of doctors. I don't know why, where they get kind of that idea that people are really trying to like fake their own disability to reap off these benefits that you said are kind of like breadcrumbs. They're like nothing. You really don't get much. And systematically, they're constantly trying to disqualify you from getting disability benefit in the first place. So oftentimes I think people have to go like months or years without any kind of support, like financial support for a while, on top of having medical bills to pay, not just like living expenses.
What infuriates me the most
Mhm.
is knowing for a fact that we're only hearing the stories from the people who have privilege and positions to share them, and or the access and resources to survive fighting this
Mhm.
institution, right?
Mhm.
I admire you and deeply respect you for your openness, your vulnerability, and your willingness to speak on this publicly. I really hope someone learns from this and can benefit. So thank you.
Yeah. And the other part that you mentioned earlier that I also wanted to talk about was the idea of self-worth and productivity. I think a lot of patients do a lot of, I mean, it's something that I had to learn myself. I didn't know that I had so much internalized ableism until I was one diagnosed, and kind of really I had to come face to face essentially with the idea that I might never recover, because now I have a diagnosis and that diagnosis technically is incurable. Up until that point, I thought I could change my lifestyle, potentially get better, like all these misconceptions. I had that, but it essentially gave me hope that I can be as productive as I want one day. And that was pretty much like my entire purpose, I think, to an extent. And then to all of a sudden be confronted with this reality that I might not be able to do anything. And especially when I had such severe symptoms that all I could do for like days on end was really just stare at the wall or just lay down and not be able to think because of severe brain fog, or because I was too exhausted to do anything, or I had too much pain to do anything. That was sort of the case. And I think a lot of people do fall into depression because of that reality. And people do end up suffering from a lot of issues with self-worth because of that. And you're absolutely right. Like in a capitalistic society, we really put productivity, we think productivity is status. Like it's a good thing to work 24/7, to stay busy all the time. And if you can't do that because you either have disability or you have other obligations, then as a society, they kind of think you're worthless. And so when that gets internalized, that's kind of where your self-worth comes from, or your value. But it took a long time to kind of not believe in that and to come out of that mentality.
Wow. Wow.
I had a conversation about that with my parents where I realized that my entire life is really just one, either using all my time and all my resources on getting diagnosed, or spending all of my time or money on getting treatment. And so I realized that my entire life pattern essentially was so that I can work just enough so that I can actually support my disability or support my illness. And then I just felt like, well, that's not really a life, it's merely surviving. And I just didn't think that kind of life was worth living for a period of time, essentially. And I actually just explicitly expressed that to my parents. And I just said, I don't think it's worth it. All I'm doing is going to work when I can, come home. I'm always alone. I'm getting treatments, paying medical bills, and that's it. That's my life. I can't even think or do anything really because I'm physically restricted. And so I expressed that, and I expected my parents to obviously get upset at the idea that I didn't really want to live or that I didn't think it was a life worth living, but I didn't expect exactly how they would react to it. And they were obviously very upset, but they also expressed that all they just want me to do is just stay alive. And they're like, we don't care. Like, we don't care what you do. We don't care what you're able to do. We just want you alive. And so I think that kind of like made me think twice about it. I was like, oh, interesting. Like, there are people who really desperately want me around. And I never really thought about that before. And I would all I was thinking was like, what for? Like, if I can't do anything, if I can't become anything, then why? But it kind of got me to think about like more inherent value to life and just value to myself. And I think over time, that that was like the biggest factor that I think that got me out of the internalized ableism, and kind of got to see myself differently. And when you really start to build your life all over again from the perspective of, oh, I'm just like worth living because I'm alive, everything kind of shifts at that point.
Wow. I want to thank you for opening up and being so honest about this part of your life and the journey that you've had to navigate and manage and go through an experience, and just recognize there's so much vulnerability there, and also say, I'm grateful you're alive. I'm grateful that you're here. I'm grateful that you chose to continue living. I'm grateful that you could find value in yourself existing beyond productivity and beyond what we are all conditioned to believe, these lies we're conditioned to believe. And I am deeply grateful, I'm humbled and honored to know you personally outside from this, and also so grateful that your parents responded the way that they did.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm just gonna give them a hug when I see them. I didn't know this part of your story, and I feel very grateful for you opening up and sharing this.
Yeah.
Now I'm in my feels.
And it kind of ties back to a lot of different things that you and I talk about, even outside of just talking about Emmy. But when we're talking about like sense of belonging and like finding our places, either in society or in our own lives or personal lives, things like that, I think it's one of the things that really brought a deep sense of belonging. That's that kind of like borderless. It's not like I have to be in a specific city, I have to be among certain people, but it's just kind of like, yeah, you belong because you deserve to just exist and just be, and you don't have to do anything. It's almost an accomplishment to just being alive. And I think that really instills a different kind of confidence and sense of belonging, where you don't have to really rely on your environment or anything that you have to do.
Yes, 100% yes. Retweet. I love that. So poetically said. We have just covered so much personal experience, so much raw, real truth, so much you. And I'm wondering if there are any misconceptions about this that you would like people to know.
Yeah, and it's gonna again kind of refer back to the things I've already mentioned, but exercise lifestyle changes is not going to fix an underlying condition. I just want to say that. It's not just for ME, but it's for any kind of chronic illness or diseases that we haven't really figured out a cure for. And oftentimes what that does is actually puts the blame on the patients. It's like, oh, you're not taking care of yourself well enough, and that's why you're sick, when that's not the case. So that's one of the bigger misconceptions that I'd like to address. And the idea that people with ME is healthy again, it's not true. Just because you can't see any kind of deformities or any kind of disability on the outside doesn't necessarily mean that someone is healthy or that they're capable of doing everything. The other one is you don't have to have necessarily a diagnosis or to be a person with disability. If you feel unhealthy, if you feel very unwell and you feel like you can't do certain things, then I think that speaks for itself. You don't need to necessarily have a diagnosis to get accommodation. And Jade, since you speak with students a lot, I know that a lot of schools do have accommodation or programs that help students get accommodation. So that's something to look into. And this idea, because we talked about how so many people are barred from having access to healthcare, especially in America, a lot of disability advocates actually pushed forward this very same idea when the COVID vaccine started rolling out. They basically said, prioritize people with disabilities so then they can get access to the vaccine first. And they don't need to bring a doctor's notes because people can't afford doctor's notes. So if people say they have underlying condition, they're one of the people at high risk, they should be able to get the vaccine. And so that was actually accomplished in California so that people with disability could get vaccine without having doctor's notes or diagnosis to prove that they have those conditions. I just want to make sure that people are aware of that. I wasn't aware of the fact that I could get accommodation for a very long time. So I didn't. I couldn't. Yeah, my specialist essentially said, how did you even graduate college? I'm like, I don't know. But yeah, like I never got accommodation until like 4 years ago. That's one of the misconception / advice that I would give people.
I love that advice. Use the resources that you have access to. I think we're living in a time now where thankfully there are much more resources available, certainly than from like when I was in college, and many campuses across the country should and do have disability rights advocate centers on campuses. And also, if you're not a college student, what does that mean? And how can you advocate for yourself and or qualify for certain things even without being able to afford to see a doctor? Thank you for speaking to that. Mm-hmm. Do you have any kind of coming to a close? Do you have any final advice or words of wisdom you'd like to share?
I do want to share resources, just quick resources. So anyone who's interested in finding out a little bit more about ME, they can go to Solve ME Initiative website. You can just Google that. And then anyone who knows or wants to know a little bit more about long COVID, they can go to Long COVID Alliance website to find out a little bit more information and get connected with a lot of different people as well.
I will put the links to those sources in the description below.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time and your energy and for you being an advocate and just you, regardless of whether or not you're an advocate. Just thank you for being you.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. I'm going to bring you back on for another episode.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, bye.
Bye.